Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be painting up another survivor for County Road Z. So I'm slowly making my way through all my survivors here. And I had the survivor here with a suit. I really wanted to try something a little different. I wanted to get something sort of like a bright color, like a bright yellow. And before, if I show you like when I'm working with Iron Fist, typically what I'll do is I'll put down maybe like a light brown color and then use these contrast paints to really make it pop and just make it stand out. But I wanted to try something just a little bit different. So this time I'm going to be going ahead and using just an acrylic paint of pink and putting that down as an initial coat. And that's going to sort of be my undercoat for my contrast paint. And so that's what I sort of did right here. Again, it's just pretty thin out fairly well, just getting some good coverage and not using about 2 coats here. And just to carefully go through the suit. And I just thought it'd be a little different, aside from your typical grays or brown suits, something of that sort. I wanted to definitely go with something that would really stand out. I sort of like that maybe as a character, someone that has absolute flash in the zombie apocalypse. So I went ahead and just gave it a good coat of this pink here to lay a foundation for that. So I've got that foundation down. I went ahead and just dry brushed it white again. And I'll go ahead and use now Imperial Yellow as a contrast paint. Now, this is going to be a little tricky. I think I might end up probably getting something a little bit more orange, but, because it is a little transparent. But I'm just going to sort of try it out and sort of see how it looks. And I think sometimes that's what you just sort of got to do is just experiment a little bit, just try to do some different things and sort of see if it works out quite well or not. As my typical contrast paints has said, you just want to try to do one section at a time. Contrast paints have this medium in it, and this allows it basically to allow some of the pigmentation to pool, and on the raised areas, really, it will thin out quite a bit. And that adds your gradation of color, it allows it basically to give a base coat and a wash pretty much at the same time. And so it's best typically to try to work on one section at a time as you're going through, because if you, let's say, paint up a section, let it dry a bit, and then go back to it, that medium is going to gather up a lot of your brush strokes. It's going to sort of get a little bit of a heavier areas and not quite spread out too well if you go over it again with a brush. Now, fortunately with Vallejo, they work pretty well. If you can add a little bit more water, that you can go back to areas there, they dry rather slow. And so in this case here, if you do need to go back to a section, you can work with it. It's, I think, a little bit easier, let's say, to work with those than, let's say, working with the Games Workshop contrast paints. Because, those dry pretty quickly. And I think then that's sort of an issue. If you go back to an area that you painted up before, then you can get these brush strokes. You'll get this uneven gloppiness on the area that you did. So, for sure in those type of paints, you want to work at one section at a time. I think the Vallejo paints, they cover very well, but they're just a little more forgiving. And so I've gone ahead here and just given it a coat of this Imperial Yellow, and we'll see how it looks. I've got that down, and that's what I figured to be maybe a little bit more orange, more of a tangerine than a bright yellow, but I sort of like it. I have to see how it works out. I'm going to go ahead and move on to his skin, and for that I'm going to be using Dwarf skin. And I go ahead and just give a coat down there. I'm just going to sort of show a little bit there. I worked on his face. I'm just going to do a little bit more on the back of his neck and on his hands. And I like this. It gives a ruddy look to him. And I think, just have maybe a different skin tone than you would, let's say, what I've done before working, let's say, like with fairy skin. And I think it looks pretty good. I think probably if you want to get like maybe a slightly darker skin tone, this Dwarf skin covers pretty well. And, gives you that slight shade that you probably would want to work with. And so I'm go ahead and just carefully go through different sections as I can. I'm going to work on his hands now. And I think it covers pretty well. And I think, definitely over that, using a gray and a dry brush of white, just gives just enough contrast in those colors there to make that contrast paint work out. Now I've got that done. It looks pretty good. And I'm going to be working on his shoes. And for this one here, I'm going to be using orange brown initially. I think I might maybe work on a two-tone for his shoes and probably like have his heels and stuff like that just be a flat brown. For those shoes, I'm just going to go ahead and give those 2 shades. I thought it'd be better than maybe just doing regular black shoes. Just something that would probably, I think, go a little bit better with a bright orange suit. Give it just a slightly different look here, maybe just some brown leather shoes. I'm pretty much going to cover those up pretty well. I'm just going to go ahead and paint out the first initial tone of just the actual shoe itself, that one tone, and then go back and do those heels and just barely tracing around the other parts of his shoe with that flat brown. In this case here too, because of the orange brown, it was pretty thinned out, so I ended up using up 2 coats. I think that's probably what I'm going to need. You can see here that I've got the shoes painted up and I've got the heel painted with a darker brown color, and I think it looks pretty good. Now, to get a little bit more of the definition of his face and even for his shoes and stuff like that, I end up using sepia ink with a wash with that. And when I do that, I typically use wet water. All wet water is I would say about 8 ounces or so of water. And you add just a small tiny drop of dish detergent with that. Just a little bit of surfactant to help break that up a bit. And the idea is that, just sort of reduce the chance of you getting, let's say, tide marks on your miniature. And these are sometimes like basically you'll have some recesses that dry higher up on the model, and in the lower areas, they retain a little bit more moisture for a while. So you end up getting this uneven look, and having a little bit of surfactant breaks that up. Now I'm going to mention here, if you look at one of my older terrain videos with the stoplight terrain, I'm sort of doing the same thing here. I'm putting on a wash here, and then the excess I'm sort of just drawing up a little bit into the paintbrush. The idea here is that you pretty much cover over some areas. You're going to have some pooling. That's a possibility there. You just touch your brush on a paper towel and then go back to those areas again that sort of pooled up a little bit. Through capillary action, you can sort of just draw all that excess ink up into your brush, and that'll give you a little bit more control. But I like this. It gives it as a good shade to his face, and his little small details. It helps us make him stand out a bit more as having that sepia ink wash. And I love sepia ink. It's just a very natural color. I'm going to do the same thing now for his shoes too. And the idea here is that there's some small little details in there. It's really sort of hard to tell. So just giving us a very light wash with this sepia ink will just help some of those details stand out a little bit more. Especially I think around his heel of his shoe and the sole of his shoe. This is going to have that little bit of that definition of that line there. And as I mentioned again, you're going to have some pooling, and that's okay. The idea is that, again, you can just take your brush, put on a paper towel, and you can just draw up the excess. And you just put your brush right back in there, and that'll just get all that excess up into that brush. And that gives you a little bit more control of where it's pooling up and how you can carefully remove that. You can see I'm doing the same thing for his hands here. The idea is to get that excess and get that drawn off, and you can get quite a bit of control doing this and prevent that dark pooling. I've got that done. I think it adds just a nice amount of subtle shade there to his skin and definitely to his shoes. So here I'm basically going to do for his hair and for the pistol, just give it a nice basic black coat of paint. You just want to carefully go through here. Just try to make sure you're not getting the other areas. And it's just a matter of simply just painting up those sections. And so I won't spend a lot of time here. You can just see I'm just carefully going through, working on the pistol, trying to get all the different angles I can. A little bit more also for the trigger guard. You can see here on the back of his hair, same thing too. Just giving a nice coat of black. Just carefully going along there. Nothing special. Just give a good base coat with that. Now for a suit, it looks pretty good, but honestly, it's just a little too orange for me. So I'm going to go back now and just use transparent yellow as an acrylic paint and pretty much just give it just a good coat with that. And that's thinned out a little bit more, but I think, actually with this orange base, it's going to look pretty good. I just want to make it just a bit more yellow, I think, rather than that tangerine color I've got here. And I do think pink would probably work maybe as a base coat if I was working with acrylic paints rather than with the contrast. And I figured it might be a little too thin, but I just want to try it out and see. And that's what I say when you're doing a lot of painting. That's what I encourage. Just try things out sometimes. You're never going to quite know until you sort of do it. And hopefully you can come back and fix those mistakes. Here it's pretty easy. Just go ahead and giving it that transparent yellow. And I think that's definitely a little bit more yellow. That's definitely the color that I sort of wanted to get. And I think actually, it gives a really nice base coat of that bright orange to give it a little bit more of a warmer yellow look. And I think it just covers up pretty well, and I think it looks pretty good for me. You can see here working on the jacket compared to his pants. There's definitely those two shades of colors that you can see. You're getting out a much brighter yellow, and that's exactly sort of what I wanted to get. And I still think it leaves some pretty warm undertones in some of the recesses and shadows a bit, having that deeper orange there. So overall, I think that this is going to be a good fix for that and give the model the look I really wanted. Now, it's definitely getting the detail more I wanted. Now, for a shirt, I went ahead and give that a shade of pale sand. I think it gives a nice cream color. And I'm going to be working on his hair. For his gun, I went ahead and did a dry brush of neutral gray. For his hair, I want to bring out, there's a small amount of some waves in his hair, a little bit of his hair strands that stand out a bit more. And I found actually that smoke, I've come to love this color. I believe it gives a very dark brown shade, and it's a perfect highlight for black. And so it still leaves that black undercoat or that undercurrent of that, but just a highlight of just a dark brown. And I think that works out actually pretty well, say if you want to do dark hair. And so that's what I'm going to go ahead and do there, is just give a dry brush to that and just to sort of make out some of the little bit of his details of his hair to stand out a bit more and give it a little bit more of a natural look with that dry brush. And there you go. I've got it done. I cleaned up the base a little bit with some acrylic paints and then added some PVA glue with some flock. And the PVA glue is still drying, so it looks a little bit more of a whiter color than I expected. And once that dries up, it's going to give out a nice dark green. And there you go. This is not going to win any awards, but frankly, I've got a backlog of survivors to paint, some zombies. I really want to get something a little bit more tabletop ready. And I love his look. That's what I sort of wanted, something that just really has some character and stands out on the table. I love the idea of this bright yellow suit of the survivors running around and just doesn't care. Has a little bit of riz and is just ready to shoot some zombies. So, sometimes to say like you can fret and agonize over models a lot of times and getting some paint jobs, but I think sometimes you just need to get some paint on some models and get them on the tabletop. And I think this guy turned out pretty good. Can't wait to get him on the table.